film was photographed during comparison trials between Churchill and Sherman tanks and provides a graphic illustration of the facts recently submitted in a report to the War Office. The terrain over which the trials were conducted was not the desert with its endless dunes, nor the typical timbered country where the only real obstacles likely to be encountered are trees, but in a latitude where every discomfort is met with, from heat and humidity to ants which crawl all over and bite at critical moments in critical spots. Added to these are the obstacles which are common to the tropics and which vary from dense undergrowth to soupy mud. The tanks used in the trials were Churchill's 4, 5 and 7, Sherman M4A1s and occasionally an M4A2. Unfortunately, before the actual trials could be commenced, crews had to be trained in the use of the Churchill tanks up to a standard required for the trial, and as this standard is high, it needed some time. This training was, however, efficiently dealt with by the British Army instructors who accompanied the vehicles, notwithstanding the difficulties under which they had to work. With the training complete and vehicles in Class 1 mechanical condition, let us now watch how they perform in the mud which is inevitably a part of New Guinea. The ground over which this Churchill is about to run appears fairly solid, when of course you can get close enough to examine it. However, just watch how these tracks gradually sink once the top crust is broken. And now Sherman on ground no more than 10 yards away from the location of the last scene. The surface here proved quite good, although of course the increased speed assisted considerably. However, speed did not assist this Sherman on this particular run. Now let us watch the performance of a Sherman M4A1 fitted with grouses and a flat rubber track in really soupy mud, where previously two tanks of a type still being used in this country became bogged down. You may recall the tank to which we refer. It is the Matilda. A Churchill tank is now run over the lane which was previously traversed by the Sherman. You will notice that the tracks of this tank have a little difficulty in getting a grip, but this is not unreasonable, as the run was made immediately following that of the Sherman, and the hull bottom appears to be dragging rather badly. Dealing now with some ditch and creek crossings, we find that the main fault of the Sherman is its tendency to nose into banks and of course can then proceed no further. In this case, recovery was made by another tank. The Churchill, on the other hand, by virtue of the forward projection of the track and high idler centre, has a considerable advantage. But because the creek bed consists of an oozy, bluish substance, providing absolutely no grip for the tracks, the tank just sinks. It might be as well to mention here that at no time were the tanks in a position where they could not be recovered by another tank. Thank goodness something got across, which shows that a careful reconnaissance of the terrain is most desirable, although often impossible. In the next trial, we can study the performance of the two types of tank while negotiating side slopes or contour chasing. In this test, the tanks were required to run up and along the side slope of a hill at angles of up to 16 degrees and make a turn towards the top of the hill of about 70 degrees to the line of advance. Notice the sureness with which the grouser-tracked Sherman grips the ground while negotiating its run. The Churchill tank does not find this so easy, for you will see here that the steering radius in low gear is such that the tracks break the ground surface and allow the vehicle to slip sideways. We will try a lighter weight Churchill over the same run, and we see the same result. Take another look at the Sherman tank and closely observe the tracks and the smooth movement of the tank. In another attempt by a Churchill, the same trouble is experienced as before, which, incidentally, is somewhat aggravated by the near side air intake louver fouling a coconut tree. In clearing this obstacle, the tank was at one time on a 22-degree side slope, which presented no difficulty. To test the hill climbing capabilities, the tanks were first run up a slope with a maximum angle at the top of 34 degrees. Here you see the grass-attract Sherman successfully negotiating this hill. On its return run to the bottom of the slope, you may observe that the engine will not hold the weight of the tank. To overcome this difficulty, it was necessary to use the steering levers, which caused the tank to slip first one way and then the other. This did not happen with the Churchill. And now a Churchill on the 34-degree slope. Although the surface of this run is still quite good, you may notice how the chevron rubber-tracked Sherman failed to overcome even a 26-degree slope. It's no use, old man, that won't help it. A similar fate is suffered by the tank fitted with steel chevron tracks. Now let us study the behavior of the vehicle on a steeper slope, in this case 40 degrees. It was found that the engine just could not take it and stalled. Notice this Churchill which is coming up and see how it side slips when the track spins. And here this Churchill doesn't seem to get a grip with one of its tracks. Finally, in this attempt, the tank reached the 40-degree part of the slope and was still moving upwards, aided by the driver steering alternately on the right and left-hand tracks. At this stage, the crew commander was ordered to halt the tank, as it was then inclined to slip sideways. When halted, the tank was on a 42-degree slope. Following this Churchill into the undergrowth, we can get some indication of its performance in this type of country. Although the undergrowth contained a considerable amount of timber, this tank always had more than enough power to overcome all obstacles, whether moving directly forward or negotiating a turn. The Churchill tank appears to have the disadvantage of collecting and keeping the foliage. This is apparently due to the shape of the turret. At this stage, neither the turret nor the cupola could be rotated. However, you will observe that a following tank could easily provide sufficient protection and information to the leading view to the shape of the turret. At this stage, neither the turret nor the cupola could be rotated. However, you will observe that a following tank could easily provide sufficient protection and information to the leading vehicle should it possibly be required in such a circumstance. Despite this thick coat of undergrowth, which gives the tank the appearance of a flower float in a parade, the crews have little difficulty in dismounting. Here first is the crew commander, followed by the co-driver. Now let's try a Sherman under similar conditions. As this vehicle progresses through the vines and trees encountered in undergrowth of this nature, it can be seen that there are certain periods when the turret is completely covered. This does not, however, prevent the rotation of the turret or cupola, and accumulations of this kind are brushed off every few yards. Here, the Sherman is temporarily stopped by a tree. This never occurs with the Churchill, which seems to have ample power to just push its way through. Despite the fact that a tree from 6 to 8 inches in diameter is resting on the turret top, you can see it is still possible to rotate the turret satisfactorily. The Sherman emerges practically free from all foliage. And now, to do something with the armament. The bunker, built of green coconut logs, appears to be the most difficult target to neutralize in this theatre of operations, and as you can see, or rather cannot see, it is most difficult to locate even at 120 yards. If you look closely on the right top of the picture, you'll observe 2 persons moving about immediately at the rear of the bunker. Now let's move up closer until we can get a look at it. Now that's better. Undergrowth increases the difficulty of the gunner in bringing fire to bear on the target even when it is located, and the use of small arms to clear it away proves both costly and ineffective. It can, however, remove a sniper from a tree or a tree from a sniper with ease. Three rounds of 75mm HE, 2, 3 were put into the bunker with this not too satisfactory result. This is certainly tough stuff. The fibers have to be literally torn apart. Another attempt was made using 2 rounds of 95mm HE with the fuse caps off. These produced little or no damage, so a further 3 rounds were tried, but this time leaving the fuse caps on. Only 2 of these actually hit the bunker. But with this very desirable effect. Delay fuses for the 75mm were not available, but it is thought that if they had been used, the result as you see it here would have been the same. .75mm white phosphorus smoke, which is being pumped into another bunker, appears to be very effective in more ways than one. However, it certainly puts up a smoke screen. Quite a few hours after, it is still burning, and that's pretty good where coconut logs are concerned. The Sherman smoke mortar in action here is fitted with a gas regulator, which when set at its lowest range is most effective in this close country. This is in direct contrast to the mortar on the Churchill, which places its smoke bombs at such a range that the screen produced is lost. It is interesting to note that 5 bombs only were used for this screen. Although, as stated previously, all recovery was possible with the aid of another tank, it was still necessary to test the capabilities in this terrain of the 2 recovery equipments available. Here is a Churchill being purposely bogged down prior to recovery by a Don 8 tractor. The tractor was first anchored to a convenient coconut tree with tow ropes, and then the winch cable was played out to the tank, where it was connected to the towing shackles by twin steel ropes. No assistance was given the tractor during the recovery, which in this case was a dead pull of both the tank and a load of earth. On this pull, the tractor was giving all it had. Uh-oh, this looks like a decent recovery job. A stringent test even for the Don 8. This one was a bit too tough for a single pull, so we used a few snatch blocks. Two, in fact. One attached to the tank on one towing shackle and the other to a convenient tree. And now for the pull, which is unassisted by the tank. Well, that seemed to be fairly easy, and in fact it did not tax the tractor to any extent. Now let's have another look at the rigging. First, the tractor is anchored to a tree stump. Then two snatch blocks are added, the first anchored to the tank, the second to a tree or stump. The cable from the winch drum is played out through the first snatch block, back to the second block, and then onto the other towing shackle of the tank. No, the tank crew's not crazy. They're only placing it back in the ditch to attempt its recovery by an armoured recovery vehicle, ARV to you, which is actually a converted Lee tank. This vehicle is supposed to anchor itself to the ground by using the rake which is attached at the rear. The teeth of this rake are approximately 3 feet in length, but as you see, they did not prevent the ARV being drawn towards the ditched tank. Two snatch blocks are used here as well, and the hookup is practically the same, except that the second block is anchored onto the ARV. As there was not sufficient length of cable to permit the ARV being anchored to a tree, this method of recovery was abandoned and another tank used to complete the job. Conditions such as these demand a rigid adherence to maintenance schedules if vehicles are to be kept in fighting trim. And here they are returning to the tank park after a day's operation. You will notice that ramps have been constructed with coconut tree trunks. These ramps were very necessary to lift the tanks out of the mud, thus facilitating maintenance. The heavy mud which packs round the tracks and suspension is thick with coconut fibre and is very difficult to displace. Complete cleanliness must be maintained, otherwise vehicle interiors become uninhabitable. This also precludes the chances of water lying about and assisting in the growth of fungus. Incidentally, it was discovered that by the simple expedient of operating all electrical and signal units for 1 hour every day, deterioration due to tropical conditions could be obviated. In this territory, rainstorms follow each other with inexorable regularity, and maintenance under such circumstances presents quite a problem. It is most essential that vehicles be carefully covered during tropical downpours, for the gutters and water takeoffs incorporated in the tank design were never intended for so much water in such a short time. As you can see, conditions are far from pleasant when it's wet. but this cannot be allowed to prevent essential repairs being completed, and to this end it is often necessary to erect a cover, as you see here. And so, with maintenance complete, they are covered up and protected from the elements. But as you must see, the tarpaulins supplied in the VOL are most inadequate, and if you cannot see from this film, you may be assured that no matter with what care they are arranged, they do not prevent the ingress of large quantities of water during tropical storms. Something better is required. In conclusion, it is hoped that the foregoing scenes have aided you in assessing the problems encountered when operating tanks over terrain such as exists in the Southwest Pacific area.